Well, hello, everyone. It's good to see your virtual faces here as we close out the fall quarter, which I think our special talks have been really exceptional, and I'm totally confident this will be no exception. So just briefly before I do the introduction, we'll keep to the same format. The presentation will be approximately an hour, and that leaves us, possibly up to a half hour for Q&A if we go that long. And at that point, do use the raise your hand symbol, and I will take care of calling on people to make questions or observations. I think I'll also point out that you can use the chat, and I'm sure many of you will, but don't expect that our speaker will be looking at questions. So if you want to pose a question, be sure to raise your hand and actually pose it in a verbal way. So I think that's all we need to say about format. So what I'd like to say now about our evening is how delighted I am, to have Dr. Barbara Hort, who's a personal friend of mine, whom I've known for many years by virtue of her friendship with my wife. Barbara and my wife met many years ago as they were attending on an annual basis seminars by Marion Woodman for many, many years. And they developed a friendship, and I got to know Barbara as a result of that friendship. And hence we have this opportunity tonight where I could invite her, had the opportunity to invite her and seized it. Barbara is a person that is, in my mind, a brilliant thinker, charming, and deeply engaged in the theater as well as depth psychology. She's maintained a Jungian-oriented psychotherapy practice in Portland, Oregon, where she lives for over 30 years. And additionally, she served on the faculties at Reed College and at Washington State University, during which time she published numerous academic articles in the fields of social and developmental psychology. For the past 10 years, she's worked in live theater, developing the practice of psychodramaturgy with Chris Coleman, the artistic director for the Denver Center for the Performing Arts. In her work as a psychodramaturge, she provides input on the psychological dynamics of the play that is used by the director and the actors to enhance their authenticity in their production and acting. Dr. Hort is the author of Unholy Hungers, Encountering the Psychic Vampire in Ourselves and Others, published by Shambhala. And she's currently seeking a publishing house for her recently completed manuscript, Hollow Crown of Fire, a discovery of meaning in the coronavirus pandemic and its predecessors, which is precisely the topic for tonight's talk. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure for me to give you Barbara to share what she's been thinking about and writing about in that book. So welcome, Barbara.
Thank you, Patrick. And thank you all for your interest in my work. Thank you for listening to this very first time I've really spoken about this very recently completed manuscript. It's the reason I won't be answering your questions while I'm speaking, because it's challenging for me to hold this all in my head as it is. So I'm going to just move through the material, and hopefully I put it into a format that will pack 72,000 words into 60 minutes in a coherent way. I'd like to offer 3 apologies in addition to that, which serve as an apology. One is that this is a work of storytelling primarily, but not necessarily mythological. So if you are disappointed at the end, I apologize. Also, it is still under editorial review by a publishing house, but there isn't yet a book for you to read if I manage to whet your appetite. And as I said, I'm not going to be answering your questions until the end, and Patrick will moderate that, but feel free to chat and question and so forth, to make notes about questions you'll have, and I'm sure there will be a few. Finally, because it's not yet published, I have no permissions for any of the manuscript's quotes or images, which means we will have no PowerPoint presentation tonight. Shocking, I realize, in this era of Zoom and electronics. So we're just going to do this old school. We're going to tell stories around the fire. It's nice that it's nighttime, about the dread beast that we have always called pestilence. And for that reason, I'm going to invoke a little bit of protection against nature's dark angels of contagion. I've actually already lit the candle because I wasn't sure that my Zoom skills were up to lighting a candle without setting my computer on fire, so I just did that before, but I will strike a bell. All right, let's begin. There is no doubt that more people have died of pestilence than of all the wars and natural disasters in human history. And yet, compared to the description of all those wars and natural disasters in our historical records, there is barely a mention made of pestilence. The question is, why is this so? The philosopher Albert Camus wrote a novel called The Plague, La Peste, in which he said, pestilence is a thing not made to human measure. Evidently, our historical chroniclers have been unable to grapple with that superhuman topic of pestilence, but our storytellers have tried. So let's look at what they've offered us. We find one of the oldest, most compelling images of human death in the Bible's books of Ezekiel and Zechariah. So that dates to like 6th century BCE, which means this myth is much older. I'm talking about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, as students of mythology, you know that the order in which those deadly horsemen appear had great meaning for the people who told that myth, and it should for us. Last of them to appear was Death, mounted on the horse called Pale, which actually meant it was corpse green, so something you can share at dinner parties. Third, riding ahead of Pestilence, was Famine on a black horse. Ahead of Famine was War, riding a blood-red horse. And first of all in the line, riding on a white-hot charger, sowing the seeds of deadly contagion, was Pestilence. Pestilence was the first of the horsemen of the apocalypse, the most powerful, the most terrifying, and yet hardly any mention from the historians. Again, why is this so? Possibly because we do not compose official accounts about the devastating monsters we cannot see or comprehend. We are silenced. Maybe we are intimidated by our terror and our lack of understanding. So we have few formal descriptions of pestilence, but we have told stories about it. You know, the guy who wrote, Barry Lopez, who wrote Crow and Weasel, said, sometimes we need a story more than food to stay alive. I believe this is because stories make meaning of our experience, especially our suffering. The Buddhists have declared, I think they're correct, that life inevitably entails suffering. And to that, Carl Jung added, the only thing that makes our suffering bearable is our ability to make meaning of it. So when pestilence rode forth again in 2019 in the form of the coronavirus, I decided to see if I could wrap the ancient arms of story around this pandemic, all pandemics, to see if storytelling might make some meaning of the monster. A lot was written scientifically, and historically, and sociologically, and even psychologically, but not so much storytelling. This is one of those fools rush in things, as you can imagine. I work in live theater now, so I chose the art of theatrical storytelling to try to embrace pestilence. And I was well aware, the ancient Greeks who gave birth to theater viewed it, theater that is, as a healing art. They placed in every one of their theaters and all their great healing centers, which, like Epidaurus was one of them, a theater. And over that theater presided Hygeia, who was the goddess of good health. So let's see if we can hope that Hygeia will bring some healing or meaning at least to this greatest illness of all, pandemic illness. In every play, we have a setting, we have a protagonist, one or more antagonists who counter protagonists. We have a narrative and we have an outcome. Specifically in the drama of pandemic diseases, we have the setting, which is the place and time that provides the context for each pandemic. We have the protagonist, which is the specific disease that enters the setting and devastates the inhabitants. We have the antagonists, or 2 sets of characters usually in these pandemic stories, the micro-antagonists of our human immune system and the macro-antagonists of human behaviors, our responses to the protagonist disease. Then we have narratives, not just histories, but stories for each pandemic that convey some of its essence. And finally, we have the outcomes, the global changes that are the meaningful outcomes for each pandemic, which in the case of the coronavirus, of course, are going to be prospective, hypothetical. So let's enter the theater of life. Let's experience the drama of pestilence. The curtain is rising. Let's talk about the setting for a minute. You know, everybody keeps talking about how this pandemic is unprecedented. So let me tell you a pandemic precedent story. We all know that a story can begin with a place or an event or a feeling, but let's begin this story with a person. He came from a corrupt and boorish upbringing, which makes it surprising that by the time the story started, he had possibly become the most powerful person in the world. As a person, he was quite unlikable. Just a second, a little, just a second, this silly thing. Excuse me, having a technical difficulty. One moment. Got it. He was, sorry. So he was rather unlikable. He motivated his followers with fear and greed and the desire to be better than everybody else. He was rich, but he did not appear to be primarily motivated by money. He was an infamous womanizer, but not primarily motivated by women. In fact, not clear at all that he even liked women. He did select as his wife a former sex worker, a foreigner who had risen from obscurity through her beauty and her sexual prowess. She was a woman whose capacity for ambition matched his own. When our story begins, this man had almost united his very diverse realm under an authoritarian style of government that had been considered obsolete until he took control. And then, at the 11th hour, there came a rumor of a disease in a foreign land that was infecting and killing people at an alarming rate. The man dismissed the rumors. He was sure that he could bully or buy off or simply ignore this immigrant invader until it crawled away. The immigrant invader was not impressed by the man's tactics. Contagion and death arrived at the man's own shores, and before he could realize what was happening, it had erupted his realm into a pandemic cataclysm, and his dreams of victory were shattered. This is not the story of the coronavirus pandemic in America. This man is not Donald Trump, and his prostitute wife is not Melania. The year is 541 CE, and the man is the Emperor Justinian, the tyrant of Constantinople. His wife was the famous prostitute, Theodora, and their dream, nearly their accomplishment, was to reunite the Roman Empire. Justinian's dream burst into bacterial flame with the arrival of the disease that we now call Yersinia pestis, plague. 10 years after plague arrived in his capital, Justinian's empire was dissolving into 5 centuries of what we now call the Dark Ages. The catalyst for the Dark Ages was the plague of Justinian. If we had more time, I could tell you 3 more stories, all uncannily familiar to the coronavirus pandemic, about the precedents of the 3 other major pandemics that have assaulted our species. The Black Death, pandemic of plague in the 14th century, which killed at least 30% of all humanity and 50% of the people living in Europe. The post-Columbian plural pandemic of the New World. This was primarily a plague of smallpox, but it included 14 other diseases that were endemic in the Old World, carried in the bodies of the conquistadors, but unknown in the New World. So in the 100 years after 1492, this plural pandemic killed about 90% of the New World's indigenous people. It was a pandemic catastrophe we cannot comprehend. And then the 1918 influenza pandemic, which is now estimated to have killed between 50 and 100 million people in the space of 2 years. The precedent stories of these pandemics would show us that we are awash in precedents. And to whatever degree we don't learn from them, we will certainly repeat their disasters to some degree. Let's talk about the protagonists, the diseases. These protagonists in our pandemic dramas each have a different profile in the ways that they invade and infest our bodies, but there are three traits that they all have in common. Number one, they are incomprehensibly small. And for most of our history, they were also invisible, visible only in their effects on us. We could not see bacteria until 1675, and we couldn't see viruses until 1931, which means that in 1918, the doctors and the scientists had no idea what was killing everyone, and they would not know until 15 years later. 1 million bacteria can dance on the point of a pin, and 1 billion viruses can dance on that same pin. Most of us human beings cannot comprehend that something so small can be so powerful. Instead, we dismiss it or we deny its existence. This may be another reason that we don't mention our pandemics in our histories. We have trouble comprehending, let alone describing, let alone even acknowledging an enemy that we cannot see, grab, and clobber with a brick. Secondly, these protagonists are incomprehensibly simple. They have only two actions in life. One, to locate a homestead in our bodies, and then once they have settled in, two, to replicate themselves as long and as fast as possible. A simplicity like that is a great advantage when you're trying to get ahead in the world. No distractions, no days off, no runs to Starbucks, no bills to pay, no woeful love life to worry about. It's a problem if someone finds your weak spot, like an antibiotic, if you're a bacteria, or a vaccine, if you're a virus. But if they don't, you are off to the races for as long as there are bodies to conquer. And that's what happens in a pandemic. Thirdly, these protagonists are incomprehensibly fast or incomprehensibly subtle. If they're fast, they possess a means of outrunning our immune systems, and if they're subtle, they possess a means of sabotaging us. And that brings us back to our current protagonist. The coronavirus is officially called SARS-CoV-2, or Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. Scientists love to describe things very accurately, but it's a wily little beast because it's not really a respiratory virus. The respiratory tract is like its port of entry, like it's Ellis Island, if you will. Each coronavirus is actually seeking a homestead in our bodies. It's called an ACE2 receptor. It's a little protein that lines every centimeter of our vascular system, and it abounds in nearly all of our major organs. So the coronavirus is really a vascular virus, and that gives it a huge selection of homesteads and a lot of highways in our bodies to travel, to go from one to another. And once it finds a home or finds a new home, then it procreates faster than rabbits, way faster than rabbits, and has much larger skill set of survival skills than rabbits do, which we'll get to in a minute. But let's turn right now to the antagonists in our pandemic stories, the human immune system and human behaviors. Now, many of you know, but some people don't know. A lot of people don't know that the human immune system, this ancient micro-antagonist, actually has two battalions. The first is our innate immune system. The innate immune system is like an army of Viking berserkers. These were the warriors that the Vikings modeled after the Wolverine. The innate immune system instantly assaults fiercely fast any substance that it deems alien, the pattern recognition detectors in our bodies, and it goes after them. And my problem is if it decides some of our own body parts are alien, then that's where our autoimmune diseases come from. But in any case, primarily, the innate immune system uses the weapon of heat, fever, inflammation, hemorrhage, in order to kill off the enemy. And that heat enables us to survive most microscopic assaults. We could hardly live past birth without the innate immune system. Sadly, in the case of pandemic diseases, while the innate immune system is trying to burn up the invaders, it usually goes overboard and burns down the house. That is us. To avoid the house burning problem, sometimes it uses anti-inflammation tactics. In other words, it tries to quench the fire with vasoconstriction and clotting. This is what's happening with coronavirus. The tactics work great most of the time, but when the innate immune system is faced with certain diseases, and the pandemic diseases all qualify in this way, it's excessive inflammation, or this collision of inflammation and clotting, have led to our deaths in the millions. In other words, these ferocious antagonists either burns down the house while it tries to burn up the home invaders, or it douses our lives trying to put out the infernos it has started. Now, this is a story of pandemic disease without vaccination, including the coronavirus. So we're killed by our innate immune responses and not by the actual disease. So people who tell you, I don't need a coronavirus vaccine or any other kind of vaccine because of a strong immune system, don't understand that it is actually our own immune system that will kill us in the case of these deadly diseases, including COVID, including measles and mumps and diphtheria and pertussis, all these diseases we vaccinate against because they were deadly at one point for this very reason. See what this story is. It's very complicated, actually, like, Shakespearean almost. All right, so the immune system has another battalion. It's called the acquired immune system. These are they're not the Wolverines, these are the trained assassins. And in our war, and they're the memory B cells and the killer T cells, and they learn how to identify the protagonist, and then they send out specific antigens, chemicals that kill it right away before it even gets a chance to set up a homestead. Their training comes either from having survived exposure to that protagonist and not dying from it, or having been exposed to a milder or partial version of the lethal protagonist. When Edward Jenner figured out that cowpox, injected a bit of cowpox into somebody would inoculate them against smallpox, that was the beginning of massive smallpox in vaccination. Today, we use a portion of the coronavirus spike to inoculate against COVID. This is how vaccination works. Now, in order to combat a disease protagonist effectively, even with vaccination, we've had to study the protagonist's effects on our immune system. So we've had to watch the battle and see what's happening. And that's how we figured out that the coronavirus was a vascular disease. First, we watched how our immune antagonist responded to the disease protagonist. Look, it's showing the kidneys and livers and guts and all these. How is it getting around if it's a respiratory virus? And of course, they figured out that it wasn't respiratory virus at all. It's just how it got it. It was sort of like when astronomers discovered Pluto. They knew Pluto was out there long before they could see it because they could see it warping the orbits of other planets. And this is the same thing has happened with the coronavirus. So what have we learned about coronavirus from its effect on immune systems? We get to do some mythology. It's very exciting. We're going to talk about the chimera. The chimera, and I know you don't know all myths from everywhere. The chimera is a part of Greek mythology. The chimera was the mother of the Sphinx, a lion in the front, a dragon behind, and coming out of the middle of the back, a fire-breathing ram. Don't ask me why. I just tell the stories. I don't make them up. There are a lot of chimerical entities. And so chimera was one of the early entities, composite entities. And Marion Woodman used to talk about how when we see a confabulation, when we see a hodgepodge of images squished together like this, we know that it's an early form, an early attempt to describe some complex energy because it couldn't figure an integrated image to describe it yet. Chimerical entities do exist, however. A biological chimera would be like a mule, combination of a horse and a donkey. Mythical chimera would be a centaur, in addition to the chimera. Centaur, horse and a man. I think Marion would say this was where you could see the energies coming together a little better, to be integrated a little bit better, so a more evolved chimera. There are human chimeras. Sometimes one twin in utero will be resorbed by the other twin. Excuse me, I have a little assistant here who's going to have to go down. Say hi to everybody. Now we're going down. Bye-bye. Okay. So one twin absorbs the other, and you have a human being who has two sets of DNA. It's very rare, but does happen. There are also chimerical viruses, and you may have seen this used to describe the coronavirus. This either happens when it's a zoonotic virus, in other words, it's jumped from animal species to species, and so you see the DNA traces in the virus, or if it's been tinkered with. And we don't know about the coronavirus yet, because that jury's still out. We know that the mythical chimera's energy was a puzzle, not only because it was confabulated, but because tracking it was very difficult. Like when they would come along and find, like it looked like somebody had been ripped up by a lion and then burned by something and also stung by a dragon, They couldn't figure out what this thing was. Sorry. I tried to find him before he was under the bed and he wanted to help. Okay, let's see if we can get this track here. All right. Where am I looking? I'm just keeping track of my outline here. So they couldn't figure out what in the world this thing was that it attacked these people. And the same is true with coronavirus, right? So we see, again, different sets of symptoms. They couldn't believe that the same virus was causing them all, but in fact, it is, because it is vascular virus. The mythical chimera was destroyed by Bellerophon, mounted on Pegasus. Bellerophon carried a stopper of lead and he shoved it down the throat of the fire-breathing ram, and the beast died. Our viral chimera must be stopped by a similar combination of human courage and creativity mounted on an elevated and nimble plane of consciousness, rather like the vaccine that is based on a revolution in microtechnology, but also like the weapons of human ingenuity that we've been employing against pandemic protagonists since long before vaccines. Let's talk about the ancient weapons of human ingenuity. Let's talk about our other set of antagonists, human behavior, us. We are this, we, us, the large part of us. I mean, these weapons are ancient, although they weren't always so ingenious, but there are a lot of, we'll talk about some of the good things we've done, not so clever things. These behaviors were originally called by Sigmund Freud defense mechanisms. But because they were not always defensive and not always mechanical, later psychologists called them coping strategies, except that a lot of times they were not effective means of coping, and they certainly were not strategic. So now we psychologists call them stress responses, which is a little bland, but at least it's tidy. Some stress responses are super helpful. Some of our stress responses are neutral or unpredictable, and some are extremely unhelpful. But we keep them even when they're unhelpful because they're based on emotions for the most part and not always on logic. Let's talk about the unhelpful ones first. The first one is denial. This is one way we respond to pandemic disease, and it's so much easier to respond to a stressor like pandemic disease because when you deny it, there's no stressor to respond to. It's a little problematic because even if we don't believe in the coronavirus still believes in us and is more than willing to take us down at its earliest opportunity. Second one is regression, when we regress into a childlike state. It's a lot easier to handle, well, it's a lot easier to face off with a pandemic stressor when some mysterious parental force, governmental, supernatural, divine, is going to intervene and handle the stressor for us. The problem is that bacteria and viruses don't pay much attention to our parental forces. They only respect the larger forces, the laws of nature, which are the same forces that created the diseases in the first place. And usually we're talking back to science. So this regressing thing doesn't usually work too well. The third one is magical thinking. Very popular among some people, much easier to handle a pandemic stressor when you redefine it so that it is a weakling that can be banished by some fantastically simple measure, like ingesting horse dewormer, and that will get rid of your coronavirus. Horse dewormer doesn't even work all that well on horse forms, and I can tell you it does not work at all on coronavirus. But some forms of magical thinking lead us to believe this. Some people would call this superstition, and we've had this been around forever. Another of our stress responses is displacement. We don't know the name of this. We call it scapegoating. It's so much easier to handle a pandemic stressor that you can't clobber with a brick when you decide that it's all the fault of somebody you can clobber with a brick, or burn in their synagogue as they did in the Black Death, or beat up in the streets if they appear to be Asian, as some people are doing in the coronavirus pandemic. And finally, there's projection. So much easier to handle your pandemic stressor when you ignite your stressful emotions in someone else, like watching someone else get frightened and angry because you're not wearing a mask or getting a vaccine. That way, you don't have to feel your own fear and anger about the pandemic. You can just belittle theirs. Now, let's look at the neutral responses. These are the ones that sometimes work, sometimes don't. One is repression, which is to repress the feelings we're having. It's much simpler and sometimes much more effective to repress your fear and your grief so that you can carry on. The backdraft of those repressed feelings will burn you eventually, but the sick people will have been cared for. The dead people will have been disposed of. The dirty work will have been done. I thank the gods for all the caregivers and the first responders who are and always have accepted being burned by the emotional backdraft of repression in order to do their thankless jobs during pandemic times. During the Black Death, the highest rate of death was in the priests and the nuns who cared for the sick. Identification is another one of the neutral stress responses. It's much simpler and sometimes more effective to model your stress response on someone else's. This works great if that person is responding effectively to the disease. It's problematic if they're modeling behavior that gets you sick or dead. Now, that's all very dreary. Let's talk about the 4 behaviors, the 4 stress responses that can really be helpful. One is rational analysis. It's most effective to tackle the problem with facts and reason. And we have been doing this since long before we had a lot of knowledge or facts or tools. The word quarantine, as many of you I'm sure know, comes from quaranta. It's an Italian word, it means 40. And it came from the fact that during the Black Death, the Italians would force ships to wait on an island for 40 days to see whether or not it was infected with plague. And if the people on the ship were not all dead by the end, they would allow it to come to land. We still quarantine for the same reason. During the Black Death, there was also a doctor, French doctor, his name was Guy de Chauliac. At that time, the Pope was in Avignon, and he actually saved the life of one Pope in particular, and probably several others, by insisting that the Pope be kept isolated from everyone else and surrounded by fire at all times. The isolation protected the Pope from pneumonic plague, and the fires protected the Pope from the bubonic plague and the rats and the fleas. And that Pope lived into his 60s and died of kidney disease. So did Guy de Chauliac live into his 60s. I'm assuming he did some of the same things for himself. So we've been very rational and tactical for a long time, even before we had a vaccine. Another very helpful stress response is anticipation and preparation, if we can get it. Louis Pasteur said, fortune favors the prepared. In this pandemic, we saw a big difference between the West Coast and the East Coast states of New York and New Jersey. Both were infected at the same time, but by some miracle, in Washington State, there was the senior residence in Kirkland, Washington, where a couple of doctors who had actually been trained at the CDC recognized it was coronavirus that these old people had died of. They put out the call, the 3 Western state governors, Gavin Newsom in California, Kate Brown in Oregon, and Jay Inslee in Washington, shut everything down. They took a lot of heat from that, particularly from the eastern parts of their states, but it didn't matter. We flattened the curve, and we did not have the refrigerator trucks full of bodies that sadly they had in New York and New Jersey, because we had warning. That was all. It wasn't like better response and better governance, just warning. Anticipation and preparation count. Humor also helps because we respond to stress better when we're not too stressed to laugh, and laughter gives us a sense of perspective and a sense of efficacy. In the book, I have visual humor, but I do have a quote from, I think it was Trevor Noah, who said at some point, "It's hard to believe that we used to eat birthday cake after someone else had blown all over it." There's a lot of stuff about the coronavirus that is worth. He also said something like, it turns out we can save the world by staying home and watching television. So let's not screw this up and do a really good job of it. So, you know, there is something to be said for taking some time to try to get a perspective and a sense of humor. But the holy grail of stress response in pandemic times is sublimation. The author of The Little Prince, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, said, "A rock pile ceases to be a rock pile the moment one person contemplates it, holding within the image of a cathedral." It took 10 years for Catherine Caricot to even get funding for her RNA research, and another 10 years for her to crack the secret to using it to deliver something to the body. It took another 10 years of collaboration with Lee Weissman to create the mRNA recipe for vaccination. When we needed their cathedral, It was no longer a pile of rocks. It took them 30 years. It only took 20 years to build the Chartres Cathedral in the Middle Ages, but who cares? When we needed the result of the immunologist sublimation, it was there for us. All right, let's talk about narratives, the narrative of these pandemics. Now, a narrative is different than a history. Statistical history is facts and figures and events and so forth. A consensual narrative, there was a Cuban philosopher named Jose Lozano de Lima, who's a philosopher and poet. And he said, consensual narrative is really the history that we remember. It's a composite of myth and facts and feelings and what matters to us, values. So what I did was look for what seemed to be consensual narratives out of the four major pandemics. In the plague of Justinian, the first recorded global pandemic, there was a chronicler who worked for Justinian, actually, didn't like him. Probably Justinian didn't like this guy either. His name was Procopius. And he wrote a lot of chronicles about Justinian's reign. But he wrote about the plague, a lot of it. And I quote quite a bit of it in the book because it is so modern, so tragic, so heartbreaking, and so familiar about first, we bury people and then we get a little faster about burying them. Pretty soon we're stacking bodies because we can't bury them fast enough. And the tragedy and people abandoning one another because they're so afraid. In his rather straightforward, simple, and deeply human account, he carries our first account of pandemic disease. Later, 8 centuries later, we have the Black Death and another account, a very similar account in the beginning of the book, The Decameron, written by Boccaccio. The book is really about 7 young people who go to a villa outside of Florence, and they are telling stories. But in the beginning, Boccaccio describes what the Black Death was like in Florence. And the similarity between his account and Procopius's makes it clear, although some historians think that they exaggerated, it's very hard to believe that when you read them side by side. They were telling horrifying truths, horrified and horrifying. But it's also important to look at the narrative of another narrative of the Black Death from an area that was suffering even more, Southeast England. It's estimated that perhaps as many as 80% of the people in Southeast England died because they may have had an anthrax epidemic. And they also had chaos, revolution in England. It was unbelievably bad. And in that area of East Anglia, there was a farm called the 100 at Farnham. It was 2,000 acres approximately, with about 2,000 people, men, women, and children, who operated the farm. And it was stewarded by a man named John Ronald. We don't know much about him, except that he kept meticulous records before the king was the law at that time. And he kept them going. At that time, there was chaos. People would slaughter their animals, slaughter each other, abandon their farms, abandon their villages. It was hell on earth, but not at the 100 at Farnham. They kept farming, husbanding their animals, fixing their houses. Half of them died, but there was no chaos. They just kept on and came out of it intact. And that is also an important story for all of us to remember out of any pandemic, that people do come through it and come out of it intact. In the post-Columbian plural pandemic, we don't have a literal account from the people of the Aztec nation for sure, any of the nations. They had not written language, they had pictorial language. They were extremely good artists, and they certainly had spoken language. There was a Franciscan friar who went as a missionary to Aztec land, we call Mexico now, and they called New Spain back then, in about 1530. He was about 30 years old. His name was Bernardino de Sahagún. He was extremely good linguist. He learned 5 of the dialects of the Aztec language, Nahuatl, and he was deeply interested in the Aztec people because he, like all the Franciscans, felt that the people of the New World would redeem the corrupt Catholic Church, which the Franciscans opposed. They felt that the beliefs of the New World would resurrect true Christianity. So their form of missionary practice was rather different from what we know now. Bernardino became very close with the Aztec people. He interviewed men, women, children about the plants, their practices, their professions, their beliefs, their diseases, and he transcribed their language into Latin script. Then he translated it into Spanish, and he wrote it on vellum, Spanish on one column, the Nahuatl on the other, and then he had them illustrate it with their beautiful multicolored art. He called this book The General History of the Things of New Spain. It was 2,400 pages long. He spent much of his life with helpers creating this book. It is a great work of, I can never remember this word, ethnology, study of another culture, really remarkable even by today's standards, because he took it directly from the people themselves without any interpretation, just what they said. While he was doing this, there was the Spanish Inquisition, and they took a very dim view of what the Franciscans were doing in general, any translating, bad. And they started demanding portions of the new history. And Bernardino first sent them the portions about the plants and other little things. But he knew that we were going to get into deep water when he got into things about their beliefs, because the Inquisition, what he was doing was basically punishable by death. He eventually sent them the whole book. We assume they destroyed it. But we know about the book because 200 years later, I mean, it's just, history. In the Laurentian Library in Florence, some dutiful librarian was going through the books and found 2 copies of the 2,400-page book. Bernardino and his colleagues and the Aztecs had made 2 copies of the book, and somehow, and we'll never know how, they got them out and they got them to Italy. And there they sat in the Laurentian Library for 200 years. In the 20th century, 2 Americans, with the help of many Mexican scholars, translated those 2 books into English, and you can now buy them from the University of Utah Press for $800, 13 different volumes. You can buy just one. They are magnificent. They're astonishing. And there's the English translation. This is called the Florentine Codex now. The most amazing part of this story, however, is that while Bernardino was writing this book, these were the people of whom 90% died of those 14 diseases. He could not save them. He could only memorialize them. And finally, we move to 1918 flu pandemic. And we look for a narrative. And we don't find one. We find Yeats's Second Coming, that poem about what rough beast its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. We find that. Yeats's wife was pregnant, during the flu pandemic and nearly died. But she didn't, nor did their child. But we find no narrative. 50 years after the pandemic, in 1968, there was a young historian standing in the Washington State University library, researching how many soldiers each city in the US lost to the First World War. And he was looking in the death records, and there were these astronomical death counts. And he knew about the flu. I mean, every historian knew the flu. But then he started to count city by city, state by state. And then he started to write to colleagues in other countries. And by the time he finished his research in 1976 and published a book, he had counted up 40 million people dead of the flu. No one had realized how many people had died until Alfred Crosby counted them. Nobody read his book, of course, except historians. But in the 1980s, another virus started killing young people, and there was no cure for it either. A lot of young people, especially homosexual men. And then people started getting interested in viruses and vaccines again. And they republished Alfred Crosby's book, Cambridge University Press did it, as America's Forgotten Pandemic, the influenza of 1918. And Alfred Crosby's work suddenly took on massive momentum. We started to be interested in the story of the 1918 flu. Of course, now we're interested in it again for much the same reasons. Let's talk about the consequences of these pandemics, the outcomes of these dramas. The plague of Justinian. I've already mentioned that after the plague of Justinian, there were 500 years of dispute, disorder, danger in Europe. We're just going to talk Europe. And at the end, there was no Roman Empire. That died at the very beginning. It was gone. In 10 years, it was gone. What there were what were called nation states that eventually became England, France, Germany, Italy. Nation states that exist still today. We have seen empires, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, but we have never seen anything like the Roman Empire since. It died with the plague of Justinian. The prevailing myth during the time of Justinian, one of them, the primary one, was the myth of Persephone, a myth in which there's a young woman, she doesn't have a name, she's the Kore, the nameless maiden, who's wandering around picking flowers, and suddenly the ground cracks open and she is yanked underground into a place that is a place of death, but she's not dead. She's just lounging on a couch. She doesn't even get to watch Netflix. She's just lying on a couch, wondering if she's going to die. She's a rape victim too, on top of everything else. But somewhere, for some reason, in that dark, deep place, she figures something out. It's a great mystery, the mystery of Eleusis. And by the end of the myth, she has a name given to her by Hecate. Her name is Persephone. She is the only deity that lives both in the upper world and the lower world. She is the goddess of transformation. Let's look at the Black Death. The Black Death actually lasted. That plague pandemic lasted for 4 years in its worst assault, started in 1347 CE, but actually it swept back and forth through the world for 4 centuries, 400 years of plague. In Shakespeare's time, 250 years after it came to Europe, they were still closing the theaters because of plague. Same plague. However, within 100 years of the arrival of plague in Europe, the Catholic Church no longer held firm control on the minds and the bodies and the souls of the Europeans because the rise of humanism had begun. Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, one stretched out in the circle, and eventually the Renaissance, and eventually the rise of science and Reformation, the rise of the middle class, the rise of the status of women, all as a consequence, a meaningful consequence of the Black Death. 27 years before the plague arrived for the Black Death, there was a book published by a man named Dante Alighieri called The Divine Comedy. And the first canto of that book was the Inferno. And it begins by a man waking up in a dark wood in a terrible descent, circles of hell, all the way down to the bottom. And a dark place, an icy place, we forget that, many people forget it, you probably don't, you're mythology students, but icy place, he meets Dis, and then he slides down the thigh of Dis, because the only way out is through. And when Dante finishes his journey, he too is changed, as the world was changed by the end of the Black Death, as the people and the world were changed. In the post-Columbian plural pandemic, there was the near annihilation of the indigenous people. There's nothing more to say. Unimaginable pain, unimaginable terror and trauma. At the end, there was a fusion of Christianity and Mesoamerican polytheism. You know, the Virgin of Guadalupe, that wonderful pagan version of the Virgin Mary. It was the thing that Bernardino and his Franciscan colleagues yearned for, an invigoration of Catholicism, a multicultural coexistence, because it was true that the indigenous peoples, the nations, had commerce between them, but also a lot of war. And one of the practices in their wars was human sacrifice and cannibalism in North America and South America, but not by the end of the plural pandemics. It was over forever. It had nothing to do with the Spaniards. They'd try to eradicate it, but that was not them. We don't know why, but one can imagine that there was so much death, it seemed redundant to be killing each other. The primary god, you of course all know that there are phoenix gods in nearly every culture of the world. I mean, it's quite remarkable. And they all look the same. It's just so cool. But in Mesoamerica, the phoenix god was one of their primary gods. His name was Quetzalcoatl, still is Quetzalcoatl. And he was a resurrection god. I mean, as the phoenixes are, he brought maize torn to the people, and he actually recreated humanity 5 times. And he is still worshipped in Mexico, primarily in a city called Cholula, which is just southwest of Mexico City. I think I'm getting that right. It's very close to Mexico City, with great festivals that exist even today. And there's a great worship of him by many, they're not just Mexican people, because there's all sorts of tribal people who call themselves the children of the feathered serpent. Something lived, something survived, greatly transformed, but still holding some essence. And finally, in the 1918 influenza pandemic, we had 50 to 100 million dead in 2 years, as I've said, with no obvious impact at the end, except 10 years of a global blowout party that we called the Roaring 20s, a subsequent decade of global depression, which one might say was as much emotional as it was economic. Then we had a Second World War, which actually is linked to the flu pandemic, which we don't have time to talk about, but precipitated in a certain key way by the flu pandemic. And that's it, sort of, except that mystery about what killed all those people is very, very important to the medical researchers. And from it was born the ability to see a virus, and study viruses, and the birth of virology and immunology. Nearly all of our current vaccines were developed in the wake of the 1918 flu pandemic. It took, 20 years. But the things that we are inoculated against, as I mentioned, of measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, and now chickenpox took 35 years to develop that vaccine, remarkable, human papillomavirus, and with the mRNA technology, maybe even HIV, but all as a result of that tragedy. For this, there is no myth because there's no narrative, but there are some links, again, not enough time to say why here, to the story of Icarus and his father Daedalus. Remember this story, Daedalus was working for King Minos, who was kind of a jackass. And so he didn't like Daedalus, got mad at him, he was afraid of him, so he put him in a tower with his son. We all know it's never a good idea to put a really smart guy in a prison with nothing else to do except to think about how to get out. I mean, we've all seen the Shawshank Redemption, right? But Minos didn't know that, so Midas didn't know that. Minos didn't know that. Anyway, so Daedalus built these sets of wings, 2 pairs of big wings, and they strapped them on, high winds blowing. And so he said to Icarus, don't fly too low, you get in the water, and don't fly too high, the wax will melt. But who can blame Icarus? Oh my goodness, right? Nobody flew. He went too high. The wax melted. The wings came apart. He plunged to his death. We don't remember that Daedalus went back and got his body. He buried him on an island that is still called Icaria. And then Daedalus went on not to just serve stupid kings, but to create really important, useful inventions. Athena was so impressed, she actually gave him the ability to fly at the end of his life. Not clear that he used it, but the things he created actually had a name. They were called, I'm not sure this is how this is pronounced, but daedala, which is still a word in Greek, meaning a creative, wonderful thing. Not unlike a vaccine. So what will be the meaningful consequences of the coronavirus pandemic? Well, of course, I don't know, I don't have a magic crystal ball, but I will say that pestilence, the first and worst of the apocalyptic portions, right? But apocalypse simply means the revelation of that which had previously been hidden or unseen. So we will be learning something, almost for sure. And if the past is any predictor of the future, as it almost always is, we already are in a descent, take down into a place where we don't know what's going to happen next. Really, how is the world going to be after? Things are dying, and I don't just mean people, expectations, notions, illusions. It is a tomb we are in, but also a womb, because things are being born. And things will be born into a new world, a different world. During any pandemic, then, we become like Icarus and Quetzalcoatl and Dante and Persephone. We are taken down into an underworld that is both a tomb and a womb. And in that underworld place, like the caterpillar and the chrysalis, we are dissolved. We are transformed. If we allow ourselves to be, when we reemerge, like the butterfly, we are the same cells as we were before, but organized in a completely different way. Sometimes the difference is subtle. Some of us are starting to emerge and say, am I different? I think a lot of us feel that we are very different, although we still don't know what to make of it. This is where we're reminded that the Greeks associated Persephone, Psyche, soul, with the butterfly. The seeds of what we will become have always been with us. You know, this is like a caterpillar. I have learned in a caterpillar, there's something called imaginal discs. I love this term, imaginal discs. They're little bundles of cells that survive that self-digestion thing the caterpillar does and the metamorphosis, and they serve as the blueprints for the different parts of the body of the butterfly. They're like little blueprints in there. And we have these two, I think, I believe. There are imaginal discs at work in each of us right now, creating the new forms that we will take in a post-pandemic world. I think the meaning that we find, each of us finds in this pandemic story, you know, what it makes of us, what we make of ourselves, it will be different for each of us. Of course, how could it not? We make meaning. Meaning doesn't just happen to us, we make it. This meaning making is a sacred journey and a perilous journey, particularly in pandemics. But particularly in pandemics, it's the only journey. If our lives are to have meaning, if all this suffering and death is to have meaning. So I wish you a safe and fulfilling and meaningful journey through this transformation. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, that was quite a tour through history.
Holy crap.
And amazingly constructed and articulated. Thank you so much. And I'm sure you have precipitated a number of questions. So, and I see some hands coming up right away. So Shelley, I see you first. So please unmute and ask.
Absolutely fascinating. I actually did a PowerPoint presentation as one of my lunchtime musings in 2014 on how to prepare for a zombie apocalypse.
Good for you.
And I actually, a lot of the information you just talked about, I was presenting to class, but I also put in some of the more modern things, like as Katrina. Most people have no idea that over 1,800 people died in Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
And even in that presentation, there were people who just had no memory or no knowledge of these disasters that have hit humanity in the past. And in my readings, and sorry, I did not write down the quote, but a philosopher or somebody wrote about the piles of dead, and that people who knew they were dying would throw their bodies into these piles. And he described them as being the living dead. And these piles of these dying people were arriving because they weren't quite dead, but they knew they were going to die. So they were throwing themselves in these piles. And at some point, he's made the mention of like 5,000 people a day were dying. I'm guessing it must have been part of this plague that you had mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
But transformation, we're in the beginnings of transformation, just like you said. I'm seeing it with people with regards to higher paid pay, which also happened in Europe after the Black Plague, and because there was a shortage of workforce,
Right.
and people are now reluctant to work. So I'm an optimist. So I very much like a phoenix believe that we're going to come out of these ashes, and hopefully we'll be all the better for it, as a world, as societies. And there's going to be lots of shifts and changes. The pendulums are going to be swinging all over the place. But I just found this very fascinating, and how you interwove so many of the different mythologies into your presentation was very, very interesting. I want to thank you. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Jacqueline?
First of all, thank you so very much for that presentation. It really was very, very wonderful, and how your storytelling of every single part was just captivating to listen to. I wanted to share my experience living through SARS in Hong Kong, because I'm actually a native of Hong Kong and lived through SARS during my 16th and 17th year. And as a theater practitioner, I think you would appreciate this. I went to a British school. And so usually the examiners would fly in from the UK to actually watch our performances. But of course, during SARS, I was not capable. So we had to perform in face masks and be video recorded, mailed back to the UK, and be graded upon that. And very much like all UK systems, 90% of your grade is based on that last performance. So that was very interesting. But then continuing on, because then I go back home at least once a year. This year is an exception, obviously, with current COVID problems. But to see our city, Hong Kong, change forever since SARS has been one of the most awesome things that I do take pride in joy in the city. Although Hong Kong is having a lot of political issues right now, as well as COVID, so that there's that. But you know, like every single building you go to, no matter how poor, no matter how rich, no matter what it is, you will always find hand sanitizers fully stocked at every single elevator lobby to this day. Sanitary is taken on such a high consideration because of SARS, and it just changed the entire way. And it's also a social change as well, because if you are sick, it doesn't matter how small the cold you are or how big the cold you are, you do not see your friends. And even if you do go to work and you just have the sniffles, you will wear a mask. So we've been living the mask culture ever since SARS. So when I hear these very unique people on American TV telling me like it's against my personal rights, it's like, that's interesting. forgive me for those people on here that don't wear masks. The social change structure, there's so much more to be said. There's small little itty bitty details of it everywhere, but that's the really big one that I wanted to point out. So thank you so much for this presentation. I felt it personally very relatable. And I wonder now on Chinese mythologies and how that would relate to SARS. I think that would be fascinating too. So
Very, I'd love to hear that.
thank
Yeah,
you again. Yeah.
fascinating. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Jessica, I see your hand.
Yes. Thank you so much. That was freaking awesome. And I have just, for the first time, heard of this job title, psychodramaturg, and I am fascinated and just love that this is a thing. So that's awesome. So I was really interested. So I've been working on some relative climate change narrative, and what you were saying about the lack of narrative around pestilence, because it's not something that we can clobber with a brick, is really stuck with me. And I think that it's just really interesting that we don't have any culturally relevant narratives on either of these things, and we're just kind of adrift without them. So I think it's just really awesome that you're shining a light on that. And I'm hopeful that there's something that we can do to change that in the future, that we can come up with narratives of past experiences, like as you're doing, which is wonderful, and for climate change as well, or climate crisis really. But this was really great. Thank you so much for sharing this.
You're welcome. I think, somebody asked me about, isn't there any kind of myth about contagion? And, without diving too far back into my own work, past, basically, I said, well, the vampire myth is a myth of contagion. It is.
Yes.
The problem is that it has so many other complexities that it's, I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole, because it's complicated, too complicated, and actual contagion is not that complicated. So it is problematic. And I think but I think that the comparison of saying we don't have climate change or climate mythology because we can't clobber that with a brick either is very apt. That's very apt, and it would be really helpful, because we have suffered from climate changes before. The Indus Valley. There are places on this earth that used to be habitable, and they are no longer. Look at Easter Island, right? Habitable no longer, really, because of things have happened, but frequently things we did. So I think that's a really apt comparison. I hope you find the answer, or find an approach.
Thank you.
Go for it.
Dia, you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to say and I put this in the chat, my 13-year-old self was totally geeking out. I was obsessed, still I'm obsessed with the Black Plague and everything about it. So thank you for that. But I kind of wanted to know what brought you to this subject. Like, have you always been interested in epidemiology and plagues, or was it like provoked with COVID, or did it come through theater? So yeah.
A friend of mine knows this. Actually, she found this book for me when I was like 8. There was this thing in the school called Junior Scholastic Books, and one of the books that I bought through that was called Epidemic Detectives. And it was actually a book about the CDC. It hadn't been that many years since the CDC was founded. And I was absolutely fascinated by the notion. It's part of the CDC, where they train physicians to track down the source of epidemic outbreaks. And in fact, it is the same school that trains the doctors in Washington State that spotted COVID when it was the COVID outbreak in the senior residence in Kirkland, Washington. So it's still there, evidently. And I think it just gripped me so much, because essentially my heart of hearts, I was raised in Judaism, but I'm basically a pagan. And, I believe that nature bats last. first and last. And the disease, like everything else, is part of how things are. And we don't necessarily, I mean, the precedents for pandemics are by and large explicable about climate changes, population densities, famines. I mean, there are reasons for this. The reason that 90% of the people in the New World died is because there had been none of those. They had never domesticated animals, so they hadn't caught the diseases. Most of our endemic diseases, childhood diseases from animals, made the jump to us, zoonotic diseases, and they never had those. And so the diseases, it was before smallpox blankets, the conquistadors didn't know what they were bringing, and it annihilated people of the New World. So these laws of nature have always been fascinating to me, always. I don't know how that relates to theater. I suppose it doesn't, but I'm
Thanks.
I never thought I'd live through a pandemic. Hopefully I lived through it, but I never thought I'd live in one. So when it was like, okay, well, now everybody gets to stay home, and I do write, and I thought, all right, Barbara, this this was pretty much what you need to do. It felt like the call, so I wrote.
I
I
might
thought it was going to be an essay. Aha, silly me.
I might suggest, if you haven't, if you're a podcast lover, there's a podcast called This Podcast Will Kill You. And it's run by two epidemiologists, and they take one disease and they break down the history and like the development of the vaccines and the cures. And it's absolutely fascinating and so well done.
Okay. What's the name of it again? This
Podcast Will Kill You.
This podcast will kill you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. Something for me to do. I'll fall down the Netflix hole. Thank you.
Emily, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara, for your wonderful paper, and congratulations on completing that manuscript. And it's just a huge undertaking of research, and I mean, cross-cultural comparisons and everything. And your paper really reminded me of Susan Sontag's Illnesses Metaphor. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it just made me want to read that again. And it's just her ideas of illness as starting with the metaphor of the passport. It's like, she says, everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick. Although we would prefer to use the good passport, sooner or later, each of us is obliged, for at least for a spell, to identify ourselves as citizens of that other place. And her study of, she looks at tuberculosis, she looks at cancer. I think she looks at AIDS as well, and looks at the way that those illnesses have been perceived and been kind of metaphoricized, and almost there's this kind of fantasy around each of them, and some are more repulsive and some are actually desirable, like the trappings of TB and the association with artists and the creative, and it's just really interesting, the material that she gets into. And when you were talking about the aspects of the coronavirus and how it's a vascular disease, and it's actually the immune system that will kill someone. I mean, I just wonder what myths will come out of that, what sort of associations, and maybe those aren't quite visible yet, there's, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or, I mean, it might just be too, but it was a very stirring talk, and it brought me back to that particular essay, and wanted to dig into those ideas a bit more. Thank you.
I think that, one thing, I mean, I do agree, each illness has, I can't say it has a personality, because really something that small, really personality, but it certainly has a profile. It has a profile, the way it acts, it does what it has to do. It has a kind of a chemical mandate, but it is very specific, right? And coronavirus is very specific. It's actually, it's like a pentathlete. It's something, we should be very respectful of this virus. It does a lot of stuff that the other viruses, you could set a watch by smallpox. Once it infects you, it always does the same thing. That is not true of coronavirus. It's a tricky bastard. So just saying. But I think one effect that pandemics have had on us now, and maybe they always have, except there's not enough literature, is that we have seen a rise of consciousness about our racial, ethnic identities, about our gender identities. And I think that's not an accident. because nature has refocused us on our existence as natural beings, on who we are as biological creatures. It is the great leveler disease. It doesn't care who we are, you know, pauper king, it doesn't care. And I think there's something about feeling ourselves as biological entities, beings, and with no better, greater or lesser worth than the coronavirus, that then says, okay, well, then who am I as a biological being? And what is this world I'm in? I think also, I mean, in addition to the terrible climate crisis we have, it's also about who am I in this climate? This could be really revolutionary, and maybe that's its outcome. I will say that the outcomes of other pandemics have taken a little longer than 2 years. So I don't think we're seeing it quite yet, but never know. But again, the imaginal discs are in there. So we might be able to detect something. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Barbara. That was really
You're
helpful.
welcome.
And I think there is that tension between the great leveler and also the kind of social and political inequities that have been revealed,
Yes.
you know, and the structures that were so implicit that are now like, wow, this is still really, we need to attend to these things. So
Yes. Yes.
thank you.
I agree. Absolutely.
I don't think I'm missing any hands. Is there somebody who would like to raise a question that hasn't, or make an observation?
I would, Patrick.
Yeah, please, Barb. Mhm.
Yes, not a question. A big gratitude to you, Barbara. What is so rich. I'm appreciating the tapestry that you wove, that you kept us light enough with that pointing to humor and entranced with the education, with the information. And I could feel from you also the holding of the devastation. And so we are still in the midst of what's occurring, and we're still walking through the grief of who has been lost. And I'm so grateful that you held this in story, that you crafted a story for us, that I feel like I can walk around now with what we are going through in a different way. And I can offer this to others, the clients that I work with, and even have some of my own questions answered, like how could people think what they think, right? With that psychoeducation piece that you put in there. Oh, that makes sense. And it helps settle many things inside me. So I'm truly grateful. Thank you for this work, this effort.
Thank you for that mirroring. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I've had some friends read the manuscript, and it's surprising to me, but very reassuring that they have said that it's oddly comforting, or reassuring, or puts a sense of context, a container, which is what stories do, right? They give us, I mean, that's in theater, but any story gives us a container that allows us to consider something unmanageable, otherwise unmanageable. And then in the story, because of the story, we may not understand every bit of it, but it gives us a handle on it. It's kind of like Helen Keller finding words for her experiences. You know, when you put a handle on something, then you can start to work with it. And if this book, assuming it becomes a book, does nothing more than that, is to give, you know, people might find their handles in different places in it. It's such a diverse book. Talking about it, it's like, whoa, look at this. Take you on a big tour. But if you can just find a handle anywhere on this thing, this pestilence thing, that's already a start. Because we don't learn about it, we don't talk about it. And, you know, they keep saying a worse one could come. It's like, you bet it could. I mean, we think this is terrible because we've lived for so long with vaccination. And so it's like, oh, the hubris of thinking that we don't need vaccines because our immune system's going to protect us is like, don't you get it? Your immune system's going to kill you. That's how it works. But never mind that. It's so that we think we're safe. It won't. It's like, oh my Lord, you know, we this disease could have been a lot worse, and So it's very helpful if we have some frame, a handle again, with which to, a standpoint, as Marion used to say, from which to meet it. And that's, if I've done nothing but create some kind of standpoint, and people will find it in different places, hopefully, a standpoint with which to meet this thing called pestilence, that would be great. That would be great.
Well, Barbara, I think your observations and what Barbara's just said really brings it full circle. I feel like that is a very good note to end on. I don't see more hands, and it just seems like a strong affirmation of what your work has offered us. And we're so privileged to be the first group you shared it with. So we really thank you for the time you've taken, not only to present this tonight, but to craft this presentation.
Thank
And
you. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you all for your smiling faces with little hands. It's very sweet. Thank you. Thank you all.
So good night to everybody. Happy holidays. Stay safe and well.
Thank you so much.